Jay?
It was interesting. I mean, I think the revival of Meghan was like the ultimate test for the royal institution, because it was like, can it adapt to a multicultural or a diverse Britain and the Commonwealth in a way that it needs to? And it was its one and only chance. And we saw that in the actions that followed, it failed at that. But so much of it was just about not defending her from the inevitable attacks and sort of one-sided coverage that came from the tabloids. You know, I think we've kind of discussed to death those early days of the headlines of Straight Outta Compton, because her mum lived 45 minutes away from Compton, and somehow the newspaper connected it together, or there was talk of her being raised on the wrong side of the tracks.
When she went to private school.
Yeah, exactly. There was, I remember the Daily Mail did a family tree of hers, and they called her family and her past sort of upwardly mobile, and it was like from cotton picking to wherever. And it was just like, okay, so already, without opening her mouth, without even knowing anything about her personality, she was getting the British tabloid treatment, which is always going to be from that place of, if you are different, we're going to treat you as such, and we're going to lean on stereotypes, and we're going to pander to the lowest common denominator, or their reader. And so I think when she then started to develop her own opinions and thoughts on things, that was like, kind of like made things doubly hard for her. And then when it got to the point where she started speaking out, because she was already a woman of color in a hallowed, ancient, traditional institution, the fact that she spoke up and didn't seem deferential to it or indebted to it for this golden opportunity made people angry. It was like, well, how dare you? You're not even supposed to be there. You should be
grateful.
You're not even supposed to be there, but you're there and you're complaining like death to you, you know? And that's kind of how it spiraled.
That's how it spiraled. I'm curious.
If you don't like Meghan, don't watch this, but people automatically assume when I say I ride for Meghan, it's because she's Black and American. Those aren't the only reasons. Y'all can't look at me and say that Meghan is not gorgeous. This bitch is stunning. She can pull anybody in the world. Harry just couldn't help himself. I understand he's half Black. The word trashy is thrown around a lot to describe Meghan. Why? Because she was divorced, an American, an actress. Camilla was still married, having a whole affair with Rumpelstiltskin. She seems so genuine and kind. No wonder she wanted to leave. She gets bullied by the media, especially the British media, daily for doing nothing. They call baby Archie a chimp, and the British media ain't see nothing wrong with it. That whole Caucasian child from the mountains of Caucasus with a 730 credit score as we speak. I refuse to sit around and watch a Black individual being bullied in a predominantly white space. I'll ride for her to the end of time. Say I won't.
Squaddies, let's take a step back for a second, because Meghan joining the royal family was never just about a wedding, a fancy dress and everybody waving from a balcony. This was supposed to be a moment, a big moment. Think about it. For centuries, the monarchy had been surrounded by tradition, protocol, and the same old royal formula. Then Meghan arrived. A woman with a different background, a woman with her own career, her own voice, her own experiences. And suddenly, here was an opportunity for this ancient institution to show the modern world, yes, we can change. Yes, we can evolve. Yes, you belong here too. That was the opportunity. And honestly, Squaddies, what could have been more powerful? You have a monarchy that constantly talks about the Commonwealth. You have millions of people from different cultures and backgrounds watching. And then you have Meghan walking into the institution as somebody who could potentially help make that connection feel real. Not just another speech about diversity, not another polished statement, a real person inside the institution. That's where the story gets interesting. Because anybody can talk about inclusion when everything is going smoothly. Anybody can stand behind a microphone and say, we celebrate diversity. Beautiful words. Everybody claps. Camera flashes. Next subject. But the real test comes when things get uncomfortable. What happens when the new person is under pressure? What happens when the headlines turn nasty? What happens when criticism starts piling up? What happens when protecting somebody becomes inconvenient? That's when you find out what an institution actually believes. And according to the argument we're discussing, that's where the monarchy failed Meghan. Because instead of seeing her arrival as an opportunity to move forward, the institution appeared to fall back into old habits when things became difficult. And that is a much bigger problem than one family disagreement. Because Meghan wasn't just another person walking through those palace doors. Her presence carried meaning. people were watching. Young people were watching. People from multicultural communities were watching. People across the Commonwealth were watching. And many could look at Meghan and think, maybe this really is changing. That's powerful. Imagine being a young person from a diverse background and seeing someone who looks different from the traditional royal image standing inside that institution. You might think, maybe there is actually a place for people like me here. That's the promise. But then comes the difficult part, because representation isn't just about putting somebody in the photograph, it's about what happens after the photograph. Anyone can invite somebody into the room. The real question is, do you stand beside them when the room gets uncomfortable? That's where this story becomes so important, because Meghan didn't need the monarchy simply to put her on a balcony. She needed an institution that could actually stand behind the values it claimed to represent. And squaddies, let's make this very simple. Imagine starting a new job. You're the new person. Everyone knows you're different from the people who have been there for years. You get criticized. People start spreading nonsense about you. And the people who have the authority to correct the situation, they suddenly become very quiet. How would you feel? Exactly. You'd be thinking, so when everything was lovely, everybody wanted me here. But now there's trouble, suddenly I'm on my own? That's the human side of this. And that's why I don't think Meghan's arrival should be viewed simply as a royal romance. It was an opportunity for the monarchy to demonstrate that an institution hundreds of years old could actually make room for modern Britain. Not just tolerate difference, embrace it. Not just celebrate diversity when it's convenient, protect it when it's challenged. And that is where the institution's response becomes so important. Because if you want people to believe you're changing, you have to show them. You can't just tell them. You have to prove it when the pressure arrives. That's the difference between a slogan and real action. And honestly, squaddies, this is something regular people understand perfectly. At work, at school, in families, in communities, we all know people who talk a good game. We're all about fairness. Everybody is welcome. We're one big team. Then trouble starts. And suddenly, crickets. Nobody wants to get involved. Nobody wants to stick their neck out. Nobody wants to make the difficult decision. That's when you discover what those beautiful words were really worth. And that's why Meghan's place in this story matters. Her arrival gave the monarchy a chance to show that it could be something more modern, more open, more representative, more connected to the people it claims to serve. But when the moment became difficult, the institution had a choice. It could move forward, or it could retreat into the familiar. And the argument here is that it chose the familiar. That's why this isn't simply about Meghan. Meghan became the test. Could this institution actually evolve? Could it protect someone who represented a changing Britain? Could it make room for a different kind of royal story? Could it turn diversity from a talking point into something real? Those were the questions. And squaddies, that's why I keep coming back to this. Meghan didn't fail the monarchy's test. The monarchy was given an extraordinary opportunity to prove it could change. And according to this argument, the institution failed that test when it mattered most.
Squaddies, have you ever watched somebody else do exactly what you did, and somehow you are the one getting in trouble? You know that feeling. At work, your colleague does something and everybody says, "Oh, that's fine." You do the same thing 2 days later. "Excuse me, we need to have a conversation." You're standing there thinking, "Wait a minute, didn't Sandra literally do this yesterday?" Exactly. And that's why the treatment of Meghan deserves a closer look. Because the issue isn't that Meghan was criticized. Nobody is saying she should have been immune from criticism simply because she married into the royal family. The issue is how ordinary things were sometimes framed when Meghan did them. Her pregnancy bump could become a story about attention-seeking, dark nail polish could somehow become a royal controversy, and suddenly, things that should have been completely ordinary were being presented as evidence of something bigger. And that's where you have to step back and ask, why? Because if another royal does something similar, and the response is warm, playful, or barely noticed, but Meghan does it and suddenly we're talking about manners, protocol, attitude, and motives, that's not just criticism anymore. That's a pattern worth examining. Imagine you walk into work wearing something perfectly normal. Nobody says anything. Your colleague comes in wearing almost the exact same thing tomorrow. Everyone says, "Oh, you look great." And you're sitting there thinking, "So when I wore it, it was a problem?" That's the frustration of a double standard. It's not necessarily about the individual incident. It's about the difference in reaction. And that's what makes the Meghan coverage so interesting. Because once a particular image of someone takes hold, almost anything they do can be interpreted through that image. If Meghan is confident, she's attention-seeking. If she's quiet, she's cold. If she's stylish, she's trying too hard. If she speaks, she's controlling the narrative. If she doesn't speak, well, somehow that's a problem too. At that point, what exactly is the woman supposed to do? stand in the corner and communicate exclusively through interpretive dance? Meghan has remained silent for 47 seconds. Royal experts are concerned. Come on. And this is why I think the conversation needs to move away from one isolated headline. Don't just look at one article. Look at the pattern. Look at the language. Look at the framing. Look at which behavior gets celebrated and which behavior gets treated with suspicion. Because words matter. If someone is repeatedly described using negative labels, eventually those labels start shaping how audiences interpret everything that person does. And that's powerful, because now the audience isn't necessarily reacting to the action itself. They're reacting to the story they've already been given about the person. That's how you can end up with something completely ordinary becoming a full-blown controversy. A nail color becomes a headline. A pregnancy gesture becomes a debate. A photograph becomes an argument. And suddenly you're wondering, are we really doing all this over nail polish? Seriously. Meanwhile, somebody else can do something similar and everybody moves on to the weather. That's why the double standard argument is important. It isn't saying Meghan should receive special treatment. It's asking for equal treatment. That's a massive difference. Equal treatment means the same behavior should at least be judged by the same basic standards. If something is inappropriate, explain why. If something breaks protocol, explain what rule was broken. If something deserves criticism, criticize the actual behavior. But don't turn every tiny detail into evidence of some terrible character flaw simply because you've already decided you don't like the person. That's where things become unfair. And regular people understand this instinctively. You know when somebody has already decided you're the difficult one in the office. Suddenly, everything you do becomes evidence. You ask a question, she's difficult. You stay quiet, she's unfriendly. You make a suggestion, she's controlling. You don't volunteer, she's not a team player. At some point you're thinking, can I just have lunch without being investigated? That's what a fixed narrative can do. Once people decide who you are, they start interpreting everything through that lens. And according to the argument we're discussing, Meghan experienced that on an enormous public stage. That's why the media coverage matters. Because newspapers weren't simply reporting what Meghan did. The framing could tell audiences how they were supposed to feel about what Meghan did. And that's a much bigger conversation. The real question is, why could the same kind of behavior receive completely different treatment depending on who was doing it? And if the answer makes you uncomfortable, maybe that's exactly why we should talk about it. Because Meghan didn't need special treatment. She needed fair treatment. And squaddies, there's a huge difference. If everybody else gets to be human, they don't get to suddenly make Meghan a crime scene because she wore the wrong nail polish. So don't get distracted by one headline. Look at the pattern, look at the language, look at the reaction, and ask the simplest question of all. If somebody else had done exactly the same thing, would we be talking about it in exactly the same way? If the answer is no, then we've got a double standard to discuss.
Squaddies, here's the part that really makes you stop and scratch your head. Because we're not talking about some random family with a WhatsApp group and one cousin who knows how to make a Facebook post. We're talking about the royal family, an institution with press offices, communications teams, journalists on speed dial, people whose actual job is to deal with the media. When a damaging story appears, there are ways to respond. A statement can be issued, a story can be challenged, a journalist can be contacted. A different version of events can be put into the public conversation. The machinery exists. So when Meghan was facing wave after wave of hostile coverage, the obvious question becomes, where was that machinery? That's the part I keep coming back to, because this isn't about asking the palace to wrap Meghan and bubble wrap and stop every newspaper from saying anything negative about her. That's impossible. She's a public figure. Criticism comes with the territory. But there is a massive difference between being criticized and watching damaging narratives pile up while the people with the power to respond appear reluctant to step in. And put yourself in Meghan's shoes for a second. You're joining one of the most famous families on earth. You're learning a completely unfamiliar system. There are protocols you've never dealt with before. There are journalists watching your every move. And then suddenly the headlines start coming. One story, then another. And you're looking around thinking, okay, who's got my back here? Anybody would ask that question. Imagine starting a new job where everybody tells you, don't worry, we've got you. Then your name starts getting dragged through the office. Rumors are flying, people are talking. And the managers who told you they'd support you, suddenly radio silence. You'd be sitting there thinking, oh, so that's what we've got you meant. Exactly. And that's why the institutional side matters. Because the palace wasn't powerless. That's the key point. The question is whether that power was used consistently.
If the communications machinery can respond when other royal figures are facing damaging coverage, then people are naturally going to notice when Meghan appears to receive a different level of support. And once you notice that difference, you start asking uncomfortable questions. Was the institution protecting the family equally? Was some members considered more important to defend than others? And who decided when the palace should speak and when it should stay silent? Those aren't crazy questions. They're basic questions about how a powerful organization operates. And silence isn't always neutral. Sometimes silence is a decision. Sometimes saying nothing allows a particular story to grow. One article becomes five becomes television discussion becomes social media outrage, and suddenly everybody is arguing about a version of events that has been repeated so many times that people assume it must be true. That's how narratives gain momentum, and regular people understand this. You don't need to be royal. We've all seen what happens when somebody spreads a rumor and nobody corrects it. First person says it, second person repeats it, third person adds a little seasoning. By Friday, the story has grown legs, opened a bank account and started paying rent. And you're standing there thinking, who invented this nonsense? Exactly. That's why having the ability to challenge a damaging story matters, because once misinformation gets comfortable, it doesn't always leave politely. And Meghan was dealing with this on a completely different scale. Millions of people could read a headline about her without ever knowing what was happening behind the scenes. That's why institutional support matters. If you're going to bring somebody into an environment that comes with extraordinary public scrutiny, surely there is some responsibility to help them navigate that environment. And especially when you're dealing with someone who is new to the institution. Meghan wasn't born into royal protocol. She didn't grow up with palace press officers explaining every move. She entered that world from the outside. So imagine the pressure. You're learning the rules while millions of people are watching you learn them. And instead of getting breathing room, every little decision can become another headline. At some point, you have to wonder what kind of support was actually being offered. Because here's the thing, squaddies. Support means something when things are difficult. Anybody can stand beside you when you're winning. Anybody can smile for the cameras when everybody is happy. But when the criticism starts, when things get ugly, when defending somebody becomes uncomfortable, that's when you find out who really has your back. And that's why this issue goes far beyond Meghan. It raises questions about the institution itself. Because if a royal family has the resources to manage the media but appears unwilling to use those resources equally, people are naturally going to question why. And that's the uncomfortable bit. The palace didn't lack power, it had plenty of it. The question is, how did it choose to use that power? And Meghan's experience is why that question refuses to disappear. Because people aren't simply asking, why didn't the palace make everyone like Meghan? They're asking something much simpler. When Meghan was under serious pressure, why didn't the people around her show the same urgency in protecting her that we know royal institutions are capable of showing? That's a completely different question. And honestly, squaddies, I think that's the question worth sitting with. Because you learn a lot about an organization by watching what it does when one of its own people is under fire, not when everything is perfect, when everything is falling apart. And if the institution's answer was silence, then people are absolutely entitled to ask why. Thank you all for watching. I am your host, Miles. Catch you all in the next episode. Goodbye.